Hey, this is Joe Gilder from Home Studio Corner. We're going to talk about analog plugins today. Take a look at my screen. Over here, we have a plugin that's modeled after analog hardware. And over here, if you're new to audio and recording, this might look familiar. This is an equalizer that allows me to boost or cut different frequencies, and I can boost and cut lots of different ones if I want to. Down here is a standard compressor that allows me to adjust the ratio, the attack, the release, the threshold, all that good stuff. Okay. Now, when I say analog plugins, obviously these are all digital, right? None of this is technically analog, but these are more digital in the sense that they're meant to do their job and to do it simply, to do it well, but to do it cleanly. Whereas these analog style plugins are meant to sound like a particular piece of analog equipment. So this one's done by Personas. I've been messing around with this recently on this mixing project I'm working on, and I really like it for a number of reasons, and I want to talk about that today. When would you choose one over the other? So I've got 3 truths to share with you to help us dive into this just a little bit. Truth number 1, all EQs and compressors do the same thing. Now, this is true, but it's also false, so it's kind of a myth as well as a truth, because I'm just feeling crazy like that. Think about it though. Yes, if I look on the screen, this is an EQ and it is boosting at 12K. This is also an EQ, it is also boosting at 12K. So they're doing the same thing, but if I grab a Stratocaster, by the way, I got a new Strat, isn't it beautiful? And I play a G chord, and I grab a 335 over there and play a G chord, guess what? They're going to sound similar. It's going to sound like an electric guitar, but they're also going to sound vastly different. I can't make the Strat sound like a 335, and I can't make the 335 sound like a Strat. They're different instruments, and there are different times when I would reach for one over the other. EQ can kind of be the same way. So when you look at EQ, maybe you're like me. For a long time, I only used Pro EQ and kind of turned my nose up at these models because I thought it's all EQ. I get more control over here anyway. Why would I bother? Well, there's reason to bother, and I'll talk about that in a second. Truth number 2, analog plugins limit your options. I alluded to this already, but if we look at this EQ versus this EQ section here, you can note there are several key differences. The first is this one has 5 bands of EQ plus a low-cut 2 low-cut filters and a high-cut filter. So I have a lot more frequencies to choose from. Also, each band is adjustable both frequency-wise. I can go all the way down to 20 hertz, all the way up to 20K with each band. I can also boost or cut by 24 decibels if I want, and I can go super narrow with the width control or super wide. When we flip over here to the analog EQ, I have less options to choose on this high frequency EQ, for example. It only goes down to about 2K up to 20K, and then I can boost or cut by 16 decibels. I can't adjust the width. That is already set in the device itself. Down here with the high mid, it's 800 to 8K, low mid is 160 to 2K, and low frequency is 20 to 250. And each of these has a gain up or down of 16 decibels. It's pretty, you can do a lot with this, but my options are somewhat limited. I can only have 4 bands of EQ. I can't do any surgical narrow cuts with the EQ, and I'm limited in what I can do in all the different frequency ranges. Another great example of this is the vintage EQ that I use all the time. This is even more limited because I can only choose between 3 different frequencies for these 2 knobs. This knob is set, there's no frequency to choose, and this one gives me 4 frequencies to choose from. So I'm severely limited in what I can do. And from that limitation comes creativity. When I limit myself to only using one electric guitar for a song, I'm creative in a different way than if I had 12 guitars around me and I got kind of bogged down with all the decisions to make. When I limit myself to saying I'm going to write a song that is only 4 minutes long, then I'm not going to write these big long bridges, and I have to be a little more creative inside those limitations. Limitations are a great way to enhance your creativity, not to limit it. So I find analog gear, for me, gives me more of a musical feel, mostly in the way that I have to work within the limitations of the piece of gear itself. Yes, they do sound different. Yes, there is a vibe there in some of the analog plugins that's not there in the kind of stock digital plugins, but I find it's not so much the vibe that I enjoy as the workflow and the limitations within that workflow. Truth number 3, you probably need both. I have a very all or nothing personality, so if I really like a particular plugin, I'll find myself wanting to use that and that alone for the rest of time. Generally speaking, that's not a great idea because there are situations where I might need one over the other or both. For example, this is an actual mix session that I was working on recently. I used this VT1 to dial in kind of the overall vibe of the EQ, right? Kind of high level tone of the recording. And use the compressor to get just like a nice smooth compression happening. But once I did that, I noticed there were a couple of frequencies that needed to be addressed. There was a little bit of low mid rumble. This was a recording of a bluegrass band all recorded with one microphone, so I couldn't turn down certain instruments. I just had to deal with what was there. The banjo and the acoustic guitar were building up around 200 hertz. So I pulled that down with a very specific kind of clinical EQ over here inside a Pro EQ. And then there was some harshness coming through from the vocal and the banjo as well. So I found that harsh frequency, and it was right here around 3.5K, and I did a pretty narrow cut there. These are two EQ moves that I absolutely could not do using this analog EQ because it's giving me generally wider boosts and cuts, more of kind of tone shaping boosts and cuts, and not specific surgical movements. That's one example of where I'll use Pro EQ for one thing and the analog EQ for another. Sometimes I just don't feel like hunting down the right set of knob twists for an analog EQ, and I'll just use Pro EQ because I can see exactly what I'm looking for and I can get exactly the tones I need pretty quickly. So there's no, as you're probably used to hearing in videos like this, there's no right or wrong, but I encourage you, if you only use one and not the other, give it a chance. If you're a Studio One user, you've got things like Fat Channel built in with a few included without you having to pay any more for any extra plugins, or maybe you've got like the UAD stuff that has a crap load of really cool analog vintage gear, and maybe you backed yourself into a UAD corner, and sometimes you just need to grab a regular EQ to fix that frequency problem that's there instead of trying to force your big fancy tube EQ compressor to fix the problem when a very simple EQ might do the trick. Okay, that's it for me. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't checked out my 5-step mixing guide yet, no problem. It's still available. Check it out at 5stepmix.com. It's absolutely free. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.